What is up, everybody? Welcome back into Shout. It's been a couple of days. The off season is starting slowly. We got a little bit of a Super Bowl here coming up in a couple of days, and then we'll be full speed ahead as we start to plot out the course for the Bills this off season. He's Ryan Talbot. I am Matt Parrino. Some breaking news earlier today: MYLES GARRETT formally requesting a trade, and so I thought, Ryan, let's get together a couple minutes, dive into our thoughts on a potential MYLES GARRETT trade or big time pass rusher trade. We touched on it last week a little bit, but we're going to get more into it on this episode. What's up, everybody? We're brought to you by Tops Friendly Markets.
That's right. Whether you're watching the Super Bowl or not, head over to Tops this week for some big game savings. They have Pepsi 6-pack bottles, buy two, get four free. Coca-Cola 12-pack cans or 8-pack bottles, buy two, get four free. They have Cheez-Its for a BOGO deal. They have pizza logs, original buffalo chicken, and also the apple dessert flavor pizza logs, buy one, get one free. Hillshire red kielbasa, buy two, get three free. Head over to Tops for those big game savings.
Yeah, so there's so much to get into here, Ryan, on this, because I think first and foremost, just setting up the fact that somehow, some way, the Bills have to address getting a game changer on defense. Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane talked about it last week. I know that these guys are costly. You know, there's not just the draft capital that you have to consider here if you go out and make a deal for MYLES GARRETT. It's also the contract on the other side of things. And where I think a lot of fans who maybe oppose a big time swing like this oppose it mostly because of, recency bias when it comes to the Von Miller deal, right? You go out, you give him a 6-year contract. 3 of those are guaranteed years at $20 million per season, and you just didn't get return on the investment that you were hoping for. But I think you have to remember there's a distinct difference between a MYLES GARRETT at 29 years old, entering 29 years old season, Max Crosby, same thing, and Von Miller, who was at 32 years old, had already had a major injury. I think it's a much different scenario going out and getting a player like MYLES GARRETT. And we talked about it when they went out and got Von Miller. There's been plenty of examples over the years where guys have played long into their 30s and found a way to have impactful seasons and stay at the top of the pass rush elite chart, if you will. And I think MYLES GARRETT is one of those guys that kind of fits into that profile.
Yeah, comparing Von Miller to a MYLES GARRETT, it's apples to oranges. It's not the same. As good as, Von Miller was when the Bills signed him, you're right. He had that major injury. He was older. You're talking about a MYLES GARRETT that has been an elite pass rusher for the entirety of his career, but is still playing at that elite level, is someone that wreaks havoc on opposing quarterbacks. It's what the Bills were trying to do when they made the move for Von Miller. Now, if you can go out and trade for a guy like this who has formally requested a trade, I don't care what Cleveland says about not trading him. At the end of the day, they're eventually going to. Push will come to shove. MYLES GARRETT has given them his career, and right now they are in a major rebuild. They are not close to being a contender. So some team is going to be able to get a difference maker at the pass rusher position. And if I'm the Buffalo Bills, I am selling the farm to do so.
Good question here when it comes to the draft capital. And I believe it was Jeremy White who had a little thread on Twitter today. As a matter of fact, I'll retweet that if you want to go and find it. That makes a lot of sense, because when you put all these teams together and start talking about, who makes the most sense for a trade partner for Garrett, I think number one, if you're a Bills fan and you want MYLES GARRETT, you have to like the fact that Brandon Beane is 2 or 3 months removed from a deal for Amari Cooper where he talked up his relationship with Andrew Berry. So there's already a situation there where these two teams, these two front offices can work together to make a deal happen. But the issue for the Bills is going to be this run of 5 seasons where they've been at the top of the AFC means they're picking at the end of the first round. So those first round draft picks, they don't mean as much or they don't value as much as maybe a pick for like the Cincinnati Bengals. I don't know what their situation is, but somewhere in the kind of one of these teams in the middle of the road, or even top of the draft this season, where if you feel like this team's not going to be good for the next couple of years, now you're banking on 2 or 3 first round picks that you're going to really be cashing in on over the next couple. You think about a team like the Atlanta Falcons that might want to make a deal like this, or another team that maybe has some cap room that could fit this contract in easily. We'll get to those ramifications in a second. But I do think that the challenging part of this is valuing what the Bills' first-round picks actually are worth to the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, 100%, because you said they have been picking at the tail end of the first round for multiple years now. So you're talking multiple firsts, at least two, probably some day two picks mixed in as well over the next few seasons. But for me, if that's what it's going to take for the Bills to do it, having to give up a few more picks because of where you are generally picking in this draft, it's something that the Bills should not bat an eye to, Matt. And you look at these first round picks, you mentioned it, it's where they're picking. They haven't picked high since the Ed Oliver draft and the top 10 where they ended up selecting him. But if you look at every first round pick after Josh Allen, who 100% A plus, home run selection, Tremaine Edmonds, same draft class, good player, not an elite player. Ed Oliver, good player, not an elite player. Rousseau, still really like him as a player, nowhere near elite at this point in time. Kaiir Elam, we've already had that discourse. We know that if anything, the relationship between the two sides needs to come to an end. And then Dalton Kincaid, yes, he dealt with an injury this year, but the return on investment. The draft is a crapshoot every year, whether you're picking first or you're picking 32nd. If I'm the Bills, you package these picks up, whatever it's going to take, and you are getting a blue chip player, an impact player. You know exactly what you're getting. And we'll talk about the contract here in a minute, but he's going to want an extension. And in doing so, you can lower his cap hit where necessary in terms of making this work if you're the Bills.
And this is not a player that you have any fear when it comes to Garrett or maybe potentially Crosby, and we can get into some other options here in a few minutes, where you're worried about there being a significant drop off over the next couple of years. I think you sign up for years 29, 30, and 31, because you're probably going to give him a new contract immediately after trading for him. Immediately, you sign up for it. I think 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 up for it. I think.
You're muted, Matt.
Weird. Keeps muting me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Where did I log off?
It was whatever was going on with your audio kept repeating the same phrase over and over, and then it muted you. So I'm not sure what that was about.
All right, let's start over. So you look at Myles Garrett over the last couple of seasons, right? Defensive player of the year in 2023, a guy that consistently year after year is at the top of the league in terms of pressures and sack production. And then you go to last year, he was the top graded Pro Football Focus pass rusher in the NFL last season. Only three players in the NFL, Jonathan Grenard from Minnesota, Chris Jones, which, by the way, what a freak that dude is at his age, and Jared Verse are the only three defensive linemen in the NFL last season with more pressures on the opposing quarterback than Myles Garrett did a season ago. And I think there's a couple of things here that you have to consider with Garrett. Adding him to a situation that's going to revitalize his career, right? So if you're worried about there being any bit of a drop-off, I think just him getting into a situation where he can legitimately take a run at a Super Bowl, where he can become that alpha, that A guy on the other side of the ball from Josh Allen, sign up for that right now. Put all the money on guarantee the 3 years over the next couple. I think you're going to get that production out of Myles Garrett. And I think the same could be said for Max Crosby as well.
Yeah, and Crosby, I see in the chat here, why are we talking about him? He's going to stay with the Raiders. I think Pete Carroll can convince him to stay, so maybe that never comes to fruition. But those are both guys where you would feel confident giving up multiple picks because of the production, because of the elite level that they play at, and being that difference maker that the Bills need at the pass rusher position. Then you go a tier down. Trey Hendrickson, and I know it sounds funny saying tier down because of where he was as on the sack list this year. He's a little bit older, though. And you have to worry about deja vu, just like we had here with Von Miller. Not that he has necessarily the same injuries or history, but guys like this don't become available often. It's what Brandon Beane kind of said in his end of the year presser. We'd love to have a difference maker like that, but they're not usually available. But if one came available, we'd love to have them. Here's your chance. Put your money where your mouth is. Put those draft picks. I know he loves draft picks. I know he loves stockpiling them. But the Bills don't necessarily need 10 draft picks in every draft, and they're going to get a few compensatory picks in this year's draft. They're going to have some mid-round picks, and they're talking about the strength of this draft being in that 20 to 70 range, so that they could still get an impact player at a position of need if they keep one of those seconds, and they keep they keep those other mid-round picks. They could maneuver some of those, package a few of them to move up. They can still get good players in this draft class, but there's no one in this draft class that is going to give you the return on investment that a Myles Garrett would give you.
So Pro Football Focus has a metric where it's kind of a formula that they put together called PRP, combined sacks, hits, and hurries relative to how many times a player rushes the passer. And according to Pro Football Focus, if you take pass rushers in the NFL last year with at least 200 pass rush snaps, Myles Garrett ranked the highest at 10.8, their metric there, above Micah Parsons, Trey Hendrickson, Frankie Louvu, the linebacker out of Washington, and Alex Highsmith. Speaking of which, you know who's on this list in the top 10? Chop Robinson, who, by the way, at the end of the last season, we're going to start talking about him as a real difference maker. So I think that Garrett, to me, I've warmed more and more up to this idea. My first thought was Crosby because of the Allen connection, the Miller connection, but I think you're moving on from Von Miller. So the timing of this is going to be interesting because I think it's going to have to be post June 1st, because you're going to have to, from a contract perspective, I'll bring it up here in a second. I think it makes more sense on the Browns end to trade him after June 1st. And then for the Bills, they're going to open up $17 million by a post-June 1st cut on Von Miller. And to me, Von Miller out and Myles Garrett in, and now you have Greg Rousseau in a contract year with still some roster control where you can let it, check it out and see what it looks like for one season with Myles Garrett. Now you might have to overpay, or you have to maybe entertain the franchise tag the following season, but it gives you a bunch of different options that I think would be in play around draft time. So it'll be interesting to see, because you're going to probably have to take the temperature, because around the draft, if you're the Browns, you might want to acquire some draft capital in this draft, depending on what you think. Or, you know what, Ryan, and this might disqualify the Bills because of how good they are. If you're the Browns and you do finally pull the trigger on a Myles Garrett trade, you want to pick as high as possible next year, or multiple picks next year, because that's when I think you're really going to want to move up to try to get the quarterback, because I don't think anybody's eager to get any of these quarterbacks in this year's class.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say to that, though, is you just never know what's going to happen on a season-by-season basis. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. When the Bills acquired the second-round pick of the Minnesota Vikings in that Stephon Diggs deal, I said, oh, man, that's going to probably be a really high pick. J.J. McCarthy's going to be starting. It's a rookie. We'll see. Then he goes on. I'm like, oh, Sam Darnold, even better. And then, oh, by the way, they go out and they rip off a 14-win season, and that ends up being pick 56. Yeah, you can look for teams that are, that you think are going to be bad. You just never know, though. It's going to come down to who, offers the most attractive package. And the main thing is, Myles Garrett says he wants to go to a contender. You would hope that teams would respect what the Browns specifically in this case, obviously, would respect what he's done for this franchise, what he's meant, to this franchise, and look to put him on a team where he can contend for a Super Bowl in the next few years, which would be a very small sample size of teams where that would, necessarily fit or work. I see we have a super chat here from our friend Thomas. I'll read it and then we'll give our thoughts on it. Beane gets less criticism than Josh Allen, but hasn't had a banger draft since 2018. He is the chief reason we keep getting bounced, no pun intended. Get it done, Beane.
So, yeah, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, that I think the approval rating for Brandon Beane is the lowest since probably the Josh Allen ascent, maybe starting in 2019 and 2020. And obviously there were some hits. I do think he's a very consistent drafter, where it seems like every year you could go through a draft class. It's not always in the first round or second round, but he does end up finding a really good player most years in the draft, which is something to be said for that. But there's also a piece where you look at a draft that completely revitalized the dynasty of the Kansas City Chiefs, the Trent McDuffie draft. The Bills need one of those. The Bills need one of those, and maybe last year's ends up being that. Maybe Keon Coleman takes a huge step. I thought Dwayne Carter was really good before the injury, but Cole Bishop not being able to get on the field until December was a huge issue. I think the criticism of Brandon Beane is warranted. I think that there's a lot of pressure on him this offseason, and from my perspective, I respect what he's saying when the Bills can't be big spenders. There's a cap situation to consider, and that they're not one player away. I generally agree with that. But Myles Garrett isn't one player, Ryan.
No.
Myles Garrett is the equivalent of 3 really good players over the course of the last couple of years the Bills have added to their defense. That's the kind of impact that I think that style of player has in a Super Bowl window in the prime years of Josh Allen. This is a little bit of a difference maker. And I think that you're so good in those middle rounds of the drafts and filling holes in free agency. That's been the MO of Brandon Beane. You spend at the top and rely on your ability to find the Mac Hollins of the world and the DeJuan Smoots of the world, the John Felicianos of the world, the David Edwards of the world to fill in along your roster. But make no mistake, you have to go out there and get the game wrecker and the game changer.
Yeah, we've talked about this. You can't have 11 all-pros on both sides of the ball, but if you can get a Myles Garrett, that makes it that much easier to plug in those other spots where it might be a player that's maybe, you're rolling the dice on a minimum deal or a very low deal, hoping that they can at least come in and if it's a defensive tackle, take on some double teams. And they're not flashy players, but when you have a guy like Myles Garrett, he elevates the play of everyone around him. And it would help a Greg Rousseau on the other side. It would help an Ed Oliver on the interior, the linebackers, the secondary, and that list goes on. It's not often that players like this become available. And again, we can argue about whether he's truly available or not because the Browns can play hardball. But he's requested the trade. He wants out of Cleveland. You at least, if you're Buffalo, have to do everything in your power to try to make this work.
We're gonna get to the super chat. Before we do, some commentary from the Peanut Gallery. My wife's still at work, showing other sections of the basement takes away from the show set. I expect. I missed the studio book. That's all. All right. So I think she meant studio look. Here's the thing: my ring light is in your car, dear. So the studio is inaccessible because you wouldn't be able to see me. Although some people might say that that's an upgrade. So that's why we have moved to this part of the basement. But I got this new standing desk. And it goes up and down. Got it off the TikTok shop. It's pretty cool. It goes up and down. I don't think you can really tell. Can you tell?
No, you could tell when it was going down there.
All right. So it's really cool. And I've been trying to walk on while I'm working during the day. Just get the laptop out, get the walking pad out, get about 10, 15,000 steps per day. So it's helpful in that way. So it was already set up. So I felt like this was the play. Sorry. If you're not happy with the look, I apologize. We'll be back to our regular scheduled program next episode. All right. Super chat from Joshua. What up, fellas? If the Browns do trade Myles Garrett, he has a no trade clause, so he will pick the team he wants to go to. So the Mills might be the team. And you just spoke about that a little bit, Ryan. And I agree with Josh. And I think that's part of the equation here is wanting to go to a place where you are like the missing piece. Like if you look at some of the contenders, right? Like I don't think the Baltimore Ravens are necessarily an elite pass rusher away. And I don't even know what the salary cap situation is. Although a Myles Garrett to the Ravens might be even scarier than what Derrick Henry was to the Ravens last year for the rest of the AFC. But I do think that the piece of it for Garrett going to a place where he can be the missing link and something that I think Sean has been chasing since he's come to Buffalo, a piece that really is the kind of game changer. I'm trying to think who was the top pass rusher on those Panthers teams, those Panthers Super Bowl teams. They had Quan Short. They used Shaq Thompson.
They had Mario Addison. And trying to think of who else. There's someone I'm missing.
They have they didn't have Julius Peppers, did they, on the Super Bowl year?
I don't believe so. Let's
look up the 2014 Carolina Panthers, but I'll pass it over to you while I look this up.
Okay. Yeah, it's if you're the Bills, you've come this close. You look at, if you want to be Brandon Beane and Sean McDermott, look how close you were the Super Bowl year, even in Carolina. You know that getting after the quarterback is a priority. The one thing about the defense of that team, the Carolina team, is they made life miserable for Peyton Manning in that Super Bowl. They created some turnovers. They created some havoc. It was the offense that didn't do enough. You know that you have Josh Allen on the offensive side of the ball. You know that he's going to be a difference maker there. You need that player on defense. And a guy like Myles Garrett, just it's too good to believe. I'm seeing some of these comments as well, cracking me up.
No, Peppers was not there. I just looked it up. Quan Short was their sack leader during that regular season at 11 sacks. So a real difference maker from the interior. And Quan Short was a little bit of a outlier because he was a bigger guy that could do both things. And he played next to Star Lotulelei, who acted as the space eater, and Short was able to kind of rush the passer, play the Ed Oliver role that I think Oliver played last season. But that's another thing. What does Myles Garrett do for the rest of this defensive line? Like, you talk about the attention he's going to now get and take away from the Ed Olivers of the world and the Greg Rousseaus of the world and the A.J. Epinezas of the world. Now A.J. Epineza becomes defensive end 3. And there's also a scenario where you cut Von Miller post June 1st designation. He's very close with Brandon Beane, and then bring him back on a team-friendly deal as like that situational pass rusher, your 4th pass rusher. Because I still think there's some value left there, just not at the price that he was at. There's so many different variables that go into this, but I think definitively the Bills do need a player that over the course of a full season and a full playoff run, they can rely upon to be consistently bringing pressure. They thought it was going to be Ed Oliver. I mean, that's why they gave him this big extension.
Right.
It just hasn't been enough of the time when it's mattered most.
No, but he would make everyone better on the defensive line. It would help a young guy like Dwayne Carter. It would help the guys that you've already had in this rotation. As I've mentioned, Greg Rousseau, A.J. Epineza, whoever else you bring in to be, those depth pieces off the edge, defensive tackle as well, just across the board. But I mean, it even help. I think it would help. It would help even more the cornerback position. And the reason I say that is, he's going to get home more times than not based on his track record. You're forcing the quarterback to get the ball out even faster. That helps a Christian Benford, who is an absolute stud this year, as their cornerback 1. It helps if they draft a cornerback with one of their picks in this year's draft to be that opposite cornerback of him. Or if you go in free agency and you find someone that you think fits the system, it helps them out. Obviously helps out Taron Johnson. Makes life easier for the safeties too, where you're going to have a second-year Cole Bishop, I would assume, starting at one spot. You probably want to bring Taylor Rapp back for the other spot in terms of starting. He's back in the fold as is, but you look at it like that, and it helps on the back end so much too, where they're going to be able to make plays. They're going to be able to jump routes, knowing that the pressure is going to get to most quarterbacks more times than not.
Thank you so much for watching on this Monday, February 3rd. We are on the heels of the Senior Bowl and headed to the Super Bowl this weekend. And then it's going to be full speed ahead as we move towards the Combine. And then obviously free agency. We'll have you covered. If you want to take it to the next level, join our Insider text line. We'll have thoughts all throughout the offseason, all the different big tentpole events. We'll have it ratchet up in there. That's 716-528-6727. It's a 2-week free trial and then $3.99 a month after that. Cost of the deal. What do you think ends up getting a Myles Garrett? Because obviously the draft capital is going to be there. The Bills have, if it happens before this year's draft, you're probably giving up a first and one of those 2s in this year, maybe a first and a future 3rd. Maybe, depending on how this all shakes out. And then potentially you could probably even throw in a player. Is there a player on the roster right now that you would be willing to part with? Because I don't think I'd be willing to give up any of the core guys, because I think adding a guy like Myles Garrett, like we just mentioned, adds to the math of what you think they can be with him now on the roster, taking some of these guys' game to the next level. So I'm not throwing in an Ed Oliver or a Greg Rousseau because I want to see what it looks like. Now, there are a couple of these extendable pieces, right? James Cook, Khalil Shakir. I'm not suggesting putting those two in a trade for him. Christian Benford, Terrell Bernard. But if the Browns come calling and saying, yeah, we want the draft capital, but we also want a player at this spot or this spot, is there somebody that you'd be more willing to move or consider moving?
I'd be willing to consider being the key word, anyone not named Josh Allen. And I know that's bold, that's there'd be some fans upset because a guy like Christian Benford, for instance, I would have my reservations there. That's a cornerback one. They're just as hard to find in this league. So, a guy like that, I would have second thoughts on, but pretty much no one's off limits to me. Benford, Deion Dawkins, Spencer Brown, those would be those guys where I would have to really consider, and I'm not even talking about their contracts right now and looking into that. There's so many layers to this deal. But if you're talking about players that you would consider, and no one's off limits minus Josh Allen on this team. Maybe that makes me a bad GM hypothetically, because I get the importance of a franchise left tackle, right tackle, cornerback one. But this is a player in his prime. This is a player that is always up for defensive MVP every single year, player of the year. He's a difference maker, and the Bills need difference makers on both sides of the ball. You need about 2 or 3 of them on each side. Offensively, the Bills have 2 skill players, Josh Allen and James Cook right now, that I would consider in that category. If you want to consider offensive linemen in that too, then yes, I throw Dawkins and Brown because of the way that they protect and block. But difference makers to me are what gets you over the top. It's what makes you a Super Bowl winner, not a contender. And a guy like MYLES Garrett can be that player for the Bills.
So some things to unpack there. There are some untouchables for me. Like, I think Spencer Brown is as untouchable. When you find a franchise tackle in this league, Deion Dawkins, both of those guys, they're kind of untouchable because unless you're willing to go through the growing pains next season of what it could potentially cost you having to develop a player in one of those spots, that's really important. And I also think you're not going to, for all that we talk about Greg Rousseau and maybe not hitting the mark in some of these big games, I do feel like there's enough in there that you have a fringe top 10 edge rusher in the league in that player, somebody who's still young, who's still kind of developing. I wouldn't be willing to kind of move on from that perspective. And I would just hate, if you're going to really bolster the defensive line, to lose a couple of these pieces that I just don't think are properly cast as 1 and 2, whichever way you want to splice them with Oliver and Rousseau. I think they're more a 2-3 or a 2A and a 2B behind a potential MYLES Garrett. Now, to get the Garrett, you take your chances and maybe you draft somebody. But I would say that the tackles are a little bit more off limits for me than anybody on the defensive side of the ball.
And that's fair. Like I said, they are key to Josh Allen. They are so important to this run game. And when you and I sit here and we really look at this, we'll look at the cap. We'll look at the, if you trade these players, this is what it means. And there's likely multiple players on the Bills where you can't move their deals or just want to make sense to. So, that's important to say at this point in time. But yeah, I look at different leagues. You look at, the NBA and the fact that it was a dumb trade. Don't get me wrong. The Mavericks were willing to move on from Luka, and you see, reportedly maybe Durant can be had. And there's all these guys that eventually teams have to move on from them, and they try to get a haul for these players. If you're the Browns, if you're going to move him to a contender, you sit there and you say, all right, which team can give me the best combination of picks and possibly a player? The Bills have players that might appeal to them, but it's going to be picks more than anything. And that's where Brandon Beane really is going to have to come off of his philosophy of keeping those picks, stockpiling those picks. They haven't panned out high for him. He's had some nice hits, mid rounds, late rounds. And you would depend on him to do that again in any of the drafts where you move on those first round picks for MYLES Garrett. But this is the guy that you say, I'm willing to give up multiple firsts, especially because they're late and they're closer to second round picks more than anything else. If you're Brandon Beane and the Bills.
So if we take a look at the scenario playing out cap wise, and a couple comments in here about trading MYLES Garrett for Cleveland will leave $36 million in dead cap over the next 2 seasons. Jason from Over the Cap does a great job over there. He put out a little bit of a thread on Twitter today, running down what has to be done for the Browns to be able to pull off a trade, is because they're going to have to get cap compliant, which would mean restructuring Deshaun Watson's contract once again, and star cornerback Denzel Ward would free up quite a bit. Then they'd have to cut Jack Conklin, their star right tackle, just to be able to give themselves the kind of space to make a deal like this happen. And then he writes, this would leave them in a Saints-like situation. Outside of those three moves, there's little they can do besides extending Greg Newsome, their other corner, and then June 1st, post-June 1sting some players so they can sign rookies. So there's some work to be done on the Brown side. And again, Andrew Berry came out recently at the end of the season and said they're not trading Myles Garrett. He went as far as to say, we envision him going from Cleveland to Canton, right? Like finishing his career in Cleveland. Interestingly enough, as Ashley Babstock from Cleveland.com put out today in a column that she wrote, one of the lines in Myles Garrett's announcement was, I don't want to go from Cleveland to Canton. I want to compete for a Super Bowl. And that's the thing here. There's no like writing on the wall. There's no path to competing. This is not a good roster. This is not a good setup. There's no quarterback there. Kirk Cousins isn't saving anything. I don't care if they go out and get him. I don't care if they draft a quarterback. I think that the leverage and the pressure is going to be turned up so much by Garrett. Eventually, he's going to find himself a new home. And in doing that, they're going to be left with a bad situation financially. But this is a team that's kind of set themselves up in that with this whole Deshaun Watson fiasco, kind of deserves it as they kind of go through the whole thing.
Right. And just for the record, Cleveland to Canton, that is a sweet 2.5-hour drive. So in terms of actual driving, that is a nice drive for the record. But I get it where he's coming from. He's given that team over the course of his career. And they've had a lot of downs, a few ups along the way. But he looks at that team now and he knows they're not in a good spot financially. They're not in a good spot talent-wise. And you just hope that an Andrew Berry, a Browns ownership team, that they respect the wishes and at least see what they can do to fulfill them. I know in every league, there are teams that play hardball. They don't care. They don't make the move. But this is not a disgruntled player that hasn't done much. This is a guy that has put up stats year after year and just been a difference maker where you have let him down over and over again, offensively or just overall in terms of being a legitimate Super Bowl team.
Thank you so much for spending part of your Monday with us here on Shout, a Buffalo Bills football podcast. We're brought to you by Tops Friendly Markets. Right now is the wonderland of freezer savings over at Tops. Find the coolest way to save this season at Tops from now through March 1st. So a month ago here, every $40 you spend on participating frozen brands earns you $10 back. Fill your freezer with family favorites and earn big rewards while you shop. The more you stock up, the more you save. Brands like Rosina, Banquet, Eggo, Smuckers, Snickers, Ben & Jerry's, DiGiorno, and so many more. The Super Pretzels, right, those are a fan favorite. Receive 1 point for every $1 you spend on participating brands and watch your points pile up. Every time you collect 40 frozen points, you can ask your cashier to redeem. Receive a coupon at checkout for $10 off your next purchase. For more info, go to topsmarkets.com/frozen. Final thought, Ryan Talbot, and we'll go to Ryan Downs with a super chat.
Final thought, Ryan. We did discuss that already about the no trade clause. So that also helps a little bit for sure in terms of making sure he does go to an actual contender. But stick with us. We're going to have a lot of thoughts on this. I know we'll have an article up on the site. We'll be talking about it with our Shout Insiders. We just hit this, but the offseason's just beginning. We are going to have a lot of thoughts about moves that the Bills can make, things that they can do to maybe get over that hump this offseason and claim the Lombardi Trophy, next year.
All right, everybody. Enjoy your week. We'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody.